The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Millbrook, Texas, when Victoria Hayes felt the rough hands of her own brother seize her arms. She never imagined that the man who had shared her childhood, who had once protected her from their father's drunken rages, would be the one to seal her fate with 30 pieces of silver. But greed has a way of poisoning even the purest hearts, and Marcus Hayes had debts that weighed heavier than blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would change everything, not just for Victoria, but for a silent Apache warrior whose golden eyes held secrets deeper than the canyons of his homeland. Victoria Hayes had always been different from the other girls in Millbrook. While they spent their afternoons gossiping about the latest fashions from back east or dreaming of suitable husbands, she found solace in the pages of her father's old books and the endless expanse of the Texas sky. At 22, she possessed a quiet beauty that drew attention without her seeking it, auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight, emerald eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding beyond her years, and a spirit that refused to be caged by society's expectations. The Hayes family had once been among Millbrook's most respected residents. Victoria's father, Thomas Hayes, had been a successful merchant before whiskey became his closest companion. After their mother died of consumption when Victoria was 15, the family had slowly crumbled like an old adobe wall in a desert storm. Thomas spent his days at the bottom of a bottle, leaving his 2 children to fend for themselves in a world that showed little mercy to the fallen. Marcus, 3 years Victoria's senior, had inherited their father's weakness, but none of his former business acumen. Where Thomas had once been shrewd with money, Marcus was reckless. Where their father had commanded respect through honest dealings, Marcus sought shortcuts that led only to deeper holes. By the spring of 1885, those holes had become caverns of debt that threatened to swallow what remained of the Hayes legacy. The trouble had started innocently enough. Marcus had befriended a group of men who frequented the saloons and gambling, halls that dotted the rougher side of Millbrook. Men like Jake Morrison, a smooth-talking card sharp from Kansas City, and Samuel Cross, whose cold smile never reached his eyes. They spoke of easy money and sure bets, filling Marcus's head with promises of quick riches that would restore the Hayes name to its former glory. Victoria had watched her brother's transformation with growing alarm. The Marcus she remembered from childhood, the boy who had held her when thunderstorms frightened her, who had shared his last piece of bread when times were hardest, had been replaced by a stranger whose eyes held a desperate gleam. She tried reasoning with him, pleading with him to stay away from Morrison and his associates, but her words fell on deaf ears, deafened by the siren call of easy fortune. The final catastrophe came on a humid evening in late June. Marcus had staggered, home from the Silver Dollar Saloon, his face bearing the telltale marks of both physical and financial beating. His clothes were torn, his lips split, and in his eyes was a fear so profound it chilled Victoria to her core. "They're coming for me, Vicky," he whispered, using the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken in years. "Morrison says I owe them $1,500, and if I don't pay by tomorrow—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Victoria understood the implication. She had heard stories of men who crossed Morrison and his associates. Some left town in the dead of night, never to return. Others were found floating face down in the creek that ran behind the old mill. Victoria felt her world tilt on its axis. $1,500 might as well have been $15,000 for all their ability to raise such a sum. The Hayes family's modest savings had been depleted months ago. Their father's shop had been sold to pay debts, and their home, the small cottage where Victoria had grown up, was already mortgaged beyond its worth. "There has to be another way," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. We could leave town, start over somewhere else. California maybe, or Colorado, we could— They'd find us, Marcus interrupted, his voice hollow. Morrison has connections everywhere. There's no running from this kind of debt, Vicky, not unless— He trailed off, his eyes avoiding hers. Unless what? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Morrison mentioned something about men who come through town sometimes, looking for women. He said they pay well, especially for someone like you. Someone educated, refined. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hand finding the doorframe for support. Marcus, you can't be serious. You can't possibly be suggesting it wouldn't be forever, Marcus said quickly, desperation making his words tumble over each other. Just until I could get back on my feet, earn enough to buy you back. Morrison says these men, they treat their employees well. It's not what you think, Vicky. It's more like being a governess or companion to wealthy men. Victoria stared at her brother, seeing clearly for the first time the depths to which he had fallen. The Marcus she had loved, the brother she had believed in despite everything, was gone. In his place sat a man so consumed by fear and selfishness that he would trade his own sister's freedom for his worthless hide. Get out, she whispered. Vicky, please, you have to understand. Get out! The words tore from her throat with such force that Marcus actually flinched. Get out of this house and don't come back. You are no brother of mine. Marcus rose unsteadily to his feet, his face cycling through emotions. Shame, anger, desperation, and finally a cold resolve that frightened Victoria more than his tears had. You think you're better than me, he said, his voice taking on a hardness she had never heard before. You think you're so pure, so righteous, but you're just a woman, Vicky. In this world, that's all you'll ever be. At least this way, you'll be a woman who serves a purpose. He turned and walked toward the door, pausing only to add, Morrison will be here tomorrow at noon. You can come willingly, or they'll take you anyway. But either way, my debt will be paid. The door slammed behind him, leaving Victoria alone in the gathering darkness of her childhood home. She sank into her mother's old rocking chair, the same chair where she had been held as a child, where she had listened to bedtime stories about brave princesses and noble knights. Now she faced a reality far grimmer than any fairy tale villain. That night Victoria barely slept. She paced the small rooms of her home, considering and discarding plan after plan. She could run, but Marcus was right about Morrison's reach. She could go to the sheriff, but Sheriff Watson was known to be in Morrison's pocket. She could appeal to the townsfolk, but the Hayes family had few friends left, and fewer still who would risk Morrison's wrath for a fallen merchant's daughter. As dawn broke over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Victoria made her decision. She would not run, she would not hide. When Morrison came, she would meet him with dignity intact, her head held high. If this was to be her fate, she would face it as her mother had taught her, with grace under pressure and strength in the face of adversity. She spent the morning preparing herself as if for her own funeral. She bathed carefully, pinned her auburn, hair into an elegant chignon, and dressed in her finest gown, a deep blue silk that had been her mother's, altered to fit Victoria's slender frame. If she was to be sold like cattle, she would at least look like a lady when it happened. At 11:30, Victoria sat at her kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. The clock on the mantel ticked away the minutes with merciless precision. 11:45, 11:50, 11:58. At exactly noon, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Through her front window she watched as 3 men dismounted outside her gate. Jake Morrison, resplendent in a black suit and silver-handled walking stick, led the way. Behind him came Samuel Cross and a third man Victoria didn't recognize, a tall, heavy-set fellow with the look of hired muscle about him. Morrison's knock was polite, almost genteel. "Miss Hayes, it's Jake Morrison. I believe your brother spoke with you about our arrangement." Victoria opened the door, meeting Morrison's cold smile with a level gaze. "My brother is no longer welcome in this house, Mr. Morrison. Whatever arrangement you believe you had with him, I am not party to it." Morrison's smile widened, revealing teeth like yellowed ivory. "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way, Miss Hayes. Your brother's debts have been transferred to you as his closest kin. It's all perfectly legal, I assure you." "Show me the papers," Victoria said firmly. Morrison produced a document from his jacket pocket, unfolding it with theatrical flair. Victoria scanned the pages, her heart sinking as she recognized Marcus's signature at the bottom, witnessed and notarized. The language was deliberately obscure, couched in legal terminology, but the meaning was clear. In exchange for the forgiveness of his gambling debts, Marcus Hayes had signed over his sister's guardianship to Jake Morrison for a period of 5 years. "As you can see," Morrison said, tucking the papers away, "everything is in order. Now, if you'll gather your things, we have a train to catch." Victoria felt the walls of her world closing in around her. The document appeared legitimate, and even if it wasn't, who in Millbrook would challenge Jake Morrison? She was trapped, as surely as if iron bars surrounded her. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "That's not your concern, Miss Hayes. Your only concern is being an agreeable traveling companion. I'd hate for this journey to become unpleasant." Victoria nodded, understanding the threat behind the polite words. She gathered a small bag of belongings, a few changes of clothes, her mother's jewelry, and the worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that had been her father's gift on her 16th birthday. As she prepared to leave the only home she had ever known, Victoria whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, asking not for rescue. She was too practical to believe in such fairy tale endings, but for the strength to survive. Whatever lay ahead, the ride to the train station passed in silence. Victoria sat rigid in the wagon, her bag clutched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Morrison and his associates spoke in low voices about business matters, occasionally glancing at her as if she were a piece of merchandise they were evaluating. The train station was bustling with the usual afternoon activity, families saying goodbye, businessmen checking pocket watches, children running between the adults' legs. Victoria watched it all through a haze of unreality. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Just that morning, she had been a free woman in her own home. Now she was property, being transported to an unknown fate by men who saw her as nothing more than a means to settle a debt. Morrison purchased tickets while Cross kept a watchful eye on Victoria. The third man, whom Morrison called Dutch, positioned himself near the platform entrance, blocking any potential escape route. Not that Victoria had any intention of running. Where could she go? She had no money, no friends, no family left who would help her. Marcus had seen to that. The train arrived in a cloud of steam and screeching metal. As Morrison guided her toward a private car near the rear of the train, Victoria caught sight of a familiar figure on the platform. Marcus stood partially hidden behind a pillar, his face haggard and his clothes disheveled. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Victoria saw something that might have been regret cross her brother's features. But it was too late for regret. Now, as the train pulled away from Millbrook, carrying Victoria toward her uncertain future, she pressed her face to the window and watched her hometown disappear into the distance. The rolling hills of Texas stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and hostile under the blazing sun. Somewhere out there, in those vast spaces between civilization and wilderness, her new life waited. Victoria closed her eyes and tried to imagine what lay ahead. Morrison had been deliberately vague about their destination, speaking only of associates and opportunities. She suspected the reality would be far grimmer than his euphemisms suggested. But whatever faced her, she was determined to meet it with courage. Her mother had taught her that a woman's true strength lay not in her circumstances, but in how she chose to face them. The train rolled on through the afternoon heat, carrying Victoria Hayes toward a destiny she could never have imagined. One that would test every ounce of strength she possessed and ultimately reveal truths about love, honor, and sacrifice that would reshape her understanding of what it meant to be truly free. The train journey stretched into its second day, winding through territories that grew increasingly desolate with each passing mile. Victoria watched the landscape transform from the familiar green hills of Texas to the harsh, unforgiving terrain of New Mexico territory. Red rock formations jutted from the earth like ancient monuments, and the air grew thin and dry, carrying the scent of sage and something wilder, something that spoke of spaces where civilization had never taken root. Morrison had revealed little about their destination, speaking only in vague terms about a business opportunity in a settlement called Copper Ridge. Victoria had never heard of the place, which didn't surprise her. The territories were dotted with dozens of small mining towns and trading posts that sprang up like desert flowers after rain, only to wither and die when the silver ran out or the trade routes shifted. On the morning of the third day, the train finally wheezed to a stop at what barely qualified as a station, a wooden platform beside a water tower surrounded by nothing but scrubland and distant mountains. Morrison gathered his belongings with the satisfaction of a man arriving home after a profitable journey. "Welcome to Copper Ridge, Miss Hayes," he said, gesturing toward a cluster of ramshackle buildings that hugged the base of a rust-colored mesa. "Your new home." Victoria's heart sank as she took in the sight of the settlement. Copper Ridge was even more primitive than she had feared, a collection of adobe houses and wooden shacks connected by dusty streets that seemed to lead nowhere. The only substantial buildings were a general store, a saloon that had seen better days, and what appeared to be a mine office near the edge of town. Beyond the settlement, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the skeletal remains of failed homesteads and the occasional cactus standing sentinel against the sky. A man waited for them beside a weathered wagon, his appearance as rough as the landscape around him. Miguel Santos had the deep tan and calloused hands of someone who had spent his life under the desert sun. His dark eyes assessed Victoria with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating livestock. "This is her?" Santos asked in accented English, circling Victoria as if she were a horse he was considering purchasing. "Miss Victoria Hayes," Morrison replied with mock formality. 22 years old, educated, well-mannered. "Exactly what you requested." Santos nodded approvingly. "She'll do. The gentleman has been very specific about his requirements." He handed Morrison a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. The agreed amount. Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. The casual way these men discussed her fate as if she were furniture being delivered drove home the reality of her situation more clearly than any legal document could have. She was no longer a person in their eyes. She was merchandise, valuable only for whatever purpose this mysterious gentleman had in mind. The wagon ride through Copper Ridge revealed a community barely clinging to existence. Most of the buildings showed signs of hasty construction and poor maintenance. Windows were boarded up, and several structures appeared to have been abandoned entirely. The few residents they passed watched the wagon with the wary expressions of people who had learned not to trust strangers. "Not much to look at," Santos admitted, following Victoria's gaze. "But the mine still produces enough silver to keep the town alive, and Don Ricardo pays well for household staff." They passed through the main part of town and began climbing, a winding road that led up the side of the mesa. The path was treacherous, carved from red rock and barely wide enough for the wagon. Victoria gripped the seat as the wheels skittered dangerously close to the edge, offering glimpses of a drop that would mean certain death. At the top of the mesa sat a compound that seemed to belong to another world entirely. High adobe walls surrounded several buildings constructed in the Spanish colonial style, complete with red tile roofs and wrought iron balconies. The main house was a sprawling hacienda that commanded a view of the entire valley below. It was beautiful in its way, but there was something fortress-like about the walls and the isolation that made Victoria's skin crawl. Heavy wooden gates swung open at their approach, revealing a courtyard filled with flowering plants and the sound of running water from a central fountain. Servants appeared to tend to the wagon, their movements efficient and silent. Victoria noticed that all of them, from the stable boys to the woman who approached to take her bag, avoided making eye contact. "Welcome to Casa del Sol," Santos said as he helped Victoria down from the wagon. "Don Ricardo's home." The woman, who had taken Victoria's bag, was perhaps 40 years old, with greying black hair pulled back severely and wearing a simple dark dress. She introduced herself as Esperanza, the housekeeper, and her English was careful but clear. "I will show you to your quarters," Esperanza said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "Don Ricardo will want to meet with you this evening." Victoria followed, Esperanza through corridors lined with religious paintings and expensive furniture that spoke of wealth accumulated over generations. The house was cooler than the desert outside, thanks to thick walls and high ceilings, but there was an oppressive quality to the silence that filled the rooms. Her quarters turned out to be a small suite of rooms on the second floor, a bedroom, a sitting area, and a private washroom with running water that seemed miraculous after the primitive conditions of Copper Ridge. The furnishings were comfortable, even luxurious, but Victoria noticed immediately that the windows were barred with decorative ironwork that was as functional as it was beautiful. "The bars are for protection," Esperanza explained, noting Victoria's examination of the windows. "There are sometimes difficulties with the Apache. They raid the settlements in the valley." Victoria nodded, though she suspected the bars served a dual purpose. She was clearly not expected to leave this place of her own free will. Esperanza provided Victoria with a dress to replace her travel-stained clothes, a simple but well-made garment in deep green that complemented her coloring. "Don Ricardo prefers his household to be properly attired," the housekeeper explained. "Dinner is served at 8 o'clock. You will join him in the dining room." Left alone, Victoria explored her new prison. The rooms were comfortable enough, stocked with books in both English and Spanish, and the view from the barred windows was undeniably spectacular. But comfort could not disguise the fundamental reality of her situation. She was a captive, purchased and delivered like a piece of property to satisfy the whims of a man she had never met. As evening approached, Victoria prepared herself for the meeting with Don Ricardo. She had spent the afternoon trying to imagine what sort of man would live in such isolation, maintaining a luxurious compound in the middle of nowhere and purchasing women to populate his household. The possibilities that occurred to her were universally unpleasant. At precisely 8 o'clock, Esperanza arrived to escort Victoria to the dining room. They walked through corridors lit by oil paintings and decorated with what appeared to be genuine artifacts from Mexico's colonial period. The dining room itself was elegant, with a long table of polished wood and walls lined with portraits of stern-faced men in military uniforms. Don Ricardo Mendoza was not what Victoria had expected. She had imagined a man like Morrison, smooth, predatory, obviously corrupt. Instead, she found herself facing a gentleman in his 50s with silver-streaked hair and intelligent dark eyes. He was impeccably dressed in evening wear that would not have been out of place in the finest restaurants of San Francisco or New York. When he rose to greet her, his manner was courteous, almost formal. "Miss Hayes," he said, offering a slight bow. "Welcome to my home. I trust your accommodations are satisfactory." Victoria managed a polite nod. "They are very comfortable, thank you." "Excellent. Please be seated. I thought we might dine together and become acquainted." The meal that followed was surreal in its civility. Don Ricardo proved to be an educated conversationalist, discussing literature, art, and current events with the ease of a man accustomed to refined society. He asked about Victoria's education, her interests, her family background, showing what seemed like genuine interest in her responses. If not for the circumstances that had brought her here, Victoria might have enjoyed the conversation. It was only as the evening progressed that she began to understand the true nature of her situation. Don Ricardo spoke of his isolation, a need for civilized company in this harsh land. He mentioned his previous companions, always in the past tense, never explaining what had become of them. He talked about the importance of loyalty, obedience, and discretion in his household staff. "You see, Miss Hayes," he said as dessert was served, "I am a man of particular tastes and specific needs. The desert can be lonely for someone of refinement. I require companions who understand the value of discretion and the importance of earning their keep." Victoria felt her blood turn to ice. The pleasant mask was slipping, revealing glimpses of something much darker underneath. "And what exactly would be expected of me?" Don Ricardo smiled, but the warmth never reached his eyes. "You will be my hostess when I entertain guests. You will provide conversation and companionship during the long desert evenings. You will maintain the standards of behavior appropriate to a lady of breeding." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "And you will remember that your continued comfort depends entirely upon your cooperation." The threat was delivered with the same polite tone he had used to discuss the weather, making it all the more chilling. Victoria understood that she was trapped as surely as if she wore chains. The desert itself was her prison, the isolation of her guard. Even if she could somehow escape the compound, where could she go? The nearest civilization was days away across terrain that would kill an unprepared traveler within hours. That night, alone in her luxurious cell, Victoria stared out at the star-filled sky and wondered if she would ever see freedom again. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and merciless under the pale light of the moon. Somewhere out there, beyond the walls of her prison, life continued in the wider world. But for Victoria Hayes, formerly of Millbrook, Texas, that world might as well have been on another planet. She had no way of knowing that her salvation would come from the very wilderness that seemed so hostile, in the form of a man who moved through the desert like smoke, and whose golden eyes held depths of understanding that transcended the barriers of language and culture. But that revelation lay in the dangerous days ahead, when the careful order of Don Ricardo's world would be shattered by forces he could never hope to control. The weeks that followed Victoria's arrival at Casa del Sol settled into a routine as rigid and predictable as the desert sunrise. Each morning, she would wake to the sound of servants moving through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets, but their presence a constant reminder that she was never truly alone. Esperanza would arrive with breakfast and a schedule of activities that Don Ricardo had planned for his newest acquisition. Victoria quickly learned the unspoken rules of her captivity. She was expected to dress appropriately for each occasion, to maintain perfect deportment at all times, and to provide intellectual stimulation during Don Ricardo's evening meals. He was a man of wide-ranging interests: politics, philosophy, art, literature, and he expected his companions to engage with these subjects at a sophisticated level. Victoria's education, which had once seemed like a luxury in frontier Texas, now became her shield against worse fates. During the daylight hours, she was given considerable freedom within the compound walls. She could walk in the gardens, read in the library, or sit on the shaded terraces that overlooked the valley below. The views were spectacular, vast expanses of desert punctuated by mesas and distant mountain ranges that changed color with the shifting light. But beauty could not disguise the fundamental reality of her situation. The walls that protected the compound from outside threats also kept her trapped within. Other women had occupied her position before her. Victoria discovered this through subtle clues rather than direct information. Esperanza would occasionally make reference to the previous señorita when explaining household routines. Victoria found feminine belongings forgotten in closets: a silk scarf, a pair of earrings, a book of poetry with someone else's name inscribed on the flyleaf. These ghostly remnants of former captives served as grim reminders of her own probable fate. Don Ricardo never explicitly stated what had become of his previous companions, but Victoria began to piece together fragments of their stories. Some had apparently left to marry men of Don Ricardo's choosing, business associates who valued refined wives and were willing to pay handsomely for them. Others had simply disappeared, their fates lost to the vast emptiness of the desert. Victoria suspected that those who proved insufficiently compliant or entertaining faced the harshest consequences of all. The man himself remained an enigma wrapped in cultivated charm. During their evening conversations, he would speak eloquently about art and literature, displaying a knowledge that rivaled any university professor. He collected rare books, fine wines, and beautiful objects with the passion of a true connoisseur. Yet beneath the veneer of sophistication lurked something predatory and cold. Victoria noticed how his eyes would linger on her when he thought she wasn't looking, assessing her reactions, cataloguing her responses for future reference. Don Ricardo's business interests remained largely mysterious, but Victoria gathered that they extended far beyond simple mining operations. Men would arrive at the compound at odd hours, often staying only long enough for private meetings in his study. These visitors were invariably rough-looking individuals who seemed out of place among the elegant furnishings, the kind of men Victoria associated with the criminal element that had frequented the saloons of Millbrook. Their presence suggested that Don Ricardo's wealth came from sources more varied and considerably less legitimate than silver mining. The compound's other inhabitants were equally mysterious. Besides Esperanza, there were perhaps a dozen servants who maintained the buildings and grounds. They went about their duties with an efficiency born of long practice, but Victoria noticed that none of them seemed particularly happy in their work. They moved with the careful deliberation of people who understood that mistakes had serious consequences. When she attempted to engage them in conversation, they would respond politely but briefly, always glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. Most intriguing of all was Carlos, Don Ricardo's personal bodyguard and enforcer. A compact man with scars on his hands and a way of moving that suggested coiled violence, Carlos shadowed his employer constantly when visitors were present. Victoria had observed him during some of the clandestine meetings, standing motionless, in corners like a weapon waiting to be drawn. His presence served as a constant reminder that Don Ricardo's power in this isolated place was absolute. As the days blended into weeks, Victoria found herself developing strategies for psychological survival. She threw herself into the books in Don Ricardo's extensive library, losing herself in worlds of fiction that temporarily allowed her to forget her circumstances. She established small routines and rituals that gave her days structure and meaning, Morning walks in the garden, afternoon reading sessions, evening preparations for dinner. These tiny acts of self-determination helped her maintain some sense of personal identity in a situation designed to strip it away. But perhaps most importantly, Victoria began to observe and catalogue everything about the compound's routines and security measures. She noted the times when guards changed shifts, the patterns of visitor arrivals, the locations of keys and weapons. She studied maps in Don Ricardo's study during her supervised visits, memorizing distances to the nearest settlements and water sources. If an opportunity for escape ever presented itself, she intended to be ready. That opportunity seemed increasingly unlikely as autumn approached. The desert heat began to moderate slightly, but the isolation remained absolute. No travelers passed, near enough to the compound to offer hope of rescue or communication with the outside world. Victoria realized that her family probably assumed she was dead by now. Even if Marcus felt guilt over his betrayal, he would have no way of knowing where she had been taken or how to find her. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Late one evening, as Victoria sat reading in her room, she heard unusual activity in the courtyard below. Voices spoke in urgent whispers, and she caught glimpses of men moving with lanterns through the darkness. Pressing herself against the barred window, she strained to understand what was happening. Apache raiding party hit the Carmichael ranch. Yesterday, she heard Carlos reporting to Don Ricardo. Killed 2 men, ran off most of the cattle. Sheriffs forming a posse, but you know how that usually goes. Don Ricardo's voice carried a note of concern. How close did they get to our operations? Close enough. Miguel thinks they might be scouting our supply routes. Could be they're planning something bigger. Victoria's pulse quickened. Apache raiders meant danger, but they also represented something else, a force beyond Don Ricardo's control, a wild card that might disrupt the careful order of her captivity. She filed this information away, wondering if the approaching threat might somehow work to her advantage. The next morning brought heightened security measures throughout the compound. Additional guards were posted at the gates and along the walls. Don Ricardo cancelled his usual afternoon ride, instead spending hours in conference with Carlos and several other men Victoria didn't recognize. The atmosphere of tension was palpable, and even the servants seemed more nervous than usual. During dinner that evening, Don Ricardo's conversation was uncharacteristically subdued. He spoke vaguely about temporary security concerns and the need for everyone in the household to remain vigilant. Victoria sensed an opportunity to gather more information. "Should I be concerned about these Apache raids?" she asked, projecting just the right amount of feminine anxiety. Don Ricardo set down his wineglass and studied her face. "The Apache are indeed a concern, my dear. They're a proud people, but they refuse to accept the inevitability of progress. They strike at settlements and supply lines, trying to drive out what they see as invaders." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But you need not worry. Casa del Sol is well defended, and I have arrangements with certain elements that help ensure our safety." Victoria filed away this intriguing hint about arrangements, but didn't press for details. Instead, she allowed Don Ricardo to steer the conversation towards safer topics. But throughout the remainder of the evening, she found herself thinking about the Apache raiders and what their presence in the area might mean for her own situation. That night, sleep eluded her entirely. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of the desert night, the distant call of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the canyon walls, the occasional footsteps of guards patrolling the compound perimeter. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Apache warriors moved through their ancestral lands, fighting a losing battle against encroaching civilization. Victoria found herself oddly sympathetic to their cause. Like her, they were trapped by forces beyond their control, struggling to maintain their identity and freedom in the face of overwhelming odds. As dawn approached, Victoria made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. If the Apache raids continued to escalate, if the situation became chaotic enough, she would find a way to use that chaos to her advantage. The thought of venturing into the desert alone was terrifying, but the prospect of spending the rest of her life as Don Ricardo's captive was worse. She had been raised to be a proper lady, trained to seek security and comfort above all else. But desperate circumstances had awakened something fierce and primal within her, a survival instinct that refused to accept defeat. The opportunity came sooner than she had dared hope. 3 days later, one of Don Ricardo's supply wagons was attacked while traveling the main road between Copper Ridge and the compound. The raiders made off with valuable merchandise and left 2 men wounded. The incident threw the entire operation into upheaval, as Don Ricardo was forced to increase security measures and alter carefully established routines. Victoria watched the chaos with growing excitement. Guards were being reassigned, schedules were changing, and the careful order that had governed every aspect of life at Casa del Sol was beginning to fracture. More importantly, she noticed that some of the newer security personnel seemed less disciplined and attentive than the usual staff. If she was going to make her move, it would have to be soon, before Don Ricardo could fully adapt to the new threat level. As she prepared for what might be her last dinner at Casa del Sol, Victoria felt a mixture of terror and anticipation that made her hands shake as she dressed. She had no clear plan beyond exploiting whatever opportunity presented itself, no real understanding of how she would survive in the desert, even if she managed to escape the compound. But anything was better than the gilded cage that had become her world. That evening, as she sat across from Don Ricardo at the polished dining table, Victoria smiled and made conversation as if nothing had changed. But beneath her calm exterior, every nerve was on edge, every sense heightened. The game of cat and mouse that had defined their relationship was about to change dramatically. Soon, very soon, she would discover whether she had the courage to seize her freedom, or if she would remain forever trapped in the beautiful, terrible world that Don Ricardo had created for his own dark purposes. The storm struck Casa del Sol on a moonless night in early October, arriving with the sudden fury that only desert weather could produce. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, illuminating the compound in stark, theatrical flashes, while thunder rolled across the mesa like artillery fire. Victoria had been lying awake, as had become her habit, listening to the night sounds and planning her escape when the first drops of rain began hammering against her barred windows. Within minutes, the gentle patter had transformed into a torrential downpour that sent servants scurrying through the corridors to secure shutters and move valuable items away from potential leaks. Victoria pressed herself against the window, watching the courtyard below transform into a temporary lake as the carefully maintained drainage systems struggled to cope with the sudden deluge. The storm provided perfect cover for what she had been planning. The guards, who normally patrolled the perimeter with clockwork precision, were now huddled under whatever shelter they could find, their attention focused on staying dry rather than watching for potential escapees. More importantly, the thunder would mask any sounds she might make during her escape attempt. Victoria had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in her sitting room were supplies she had gradually accumulated: a water bottle filled from her wash basin each night, dried fruit and bread hoarded from her meals, a small knife she had managed to steal from the kitchen during one of her supervised visits. She had also fashioned rough desert clothing from spare linens, understanding that her fine dresses would be worse than useless in the wilderness. The most crucial element of her plan involved the compound's security routines, which she had memorized with the dedication of a scholar studying sacred texts. She knew that the guards changed shifts at midnight, creating a brief window when certain sections of the perimeter were momentarily unobserved. She knew which doors were kept locked and which were secured only by simple latches. Most importantly, she had discovered a section of the compound's outer wall where erosion had created handholds that an agile person might use to climb over. As the storm reached its peak intensity, Victoria made her move. She changed into her makeshift desert outfit, loose trousers and a long-sleeved shirt that would protect her from thorns and sun exposure, with a hooded cloak to shield her face. She secured her meager supplies in a small bundle and made her way to the door of her suite. The corridors of Casa del Sol were dimly lit by oil lamps that flickered in the drafts created by the storm. Victoria moved with painstaking care, avoiding the floorboards she knew creaked and timing her movements to coincide with thunder crashes that would cover any inadvertent sounds. The servants' quarters were located on the ground floor, and she could hear voices and activity as the household staff dealt with storm-related emergencies. Her route took her through the main hall, past Don Ricardo's study, where lamplight still glowed beneath the door. She could hear voices inside, Don Ricardo and Carlos discussing something in urgent tones. Victoria paused long enough to catch fragments of their conversation. "Doubled the patrols on the southern approach," Carlos was saying. "But if they're planning a major assault, we need to consider moving some of the more valuable assets to the secondary location." "Not yet," Don Ricardo replied. "I won't be driven from my own home by a handful of savages. Besides, the girl represents too significant an investment to risk transporting her in this weather." Victoria's blood chilled as she realized they were discussing her. She was Don Ricardo's valuable asset, his investment that he was reluctant to risk moving. The casual way they spoke of her, as if she were a piece of expensive furniture, reinforced her determination to escape this nightmare. Moving past the study, Victoria made her way to the rear of the compound, where the kitchens and storage areas were located. This section of the building was older and more roughly constructed than the main house, with stone walls that had been built for utility rather than elegance. Here she had discovered her escape route, a narrow staircase that led to a storage area on the upper level, which in turn provided access to a section of the outer wall. The storage room was filled with sacks of grain and preserved foods, creating a maze of obstacles that Victoria navigated by feel in the near-total darkness. At the far end of the room, a small window opened onto a ledge that ran along the compound's outer wall. Victoria had tested this route twice before during her supervised walks, always under the pretense of admiring the view or seeking fresh air. The window opened with a protest of rusty hinges that was mercifully covered by a crash of thunder. Rain immediately soaked through Victoria's clothing as she squeezed through the narrow opening onto the ledge. The stone was slippery with water, and the wind threatened to tear her from her precarious perch. For a moment, the sheer terror of her situation nearly overwhelmed her resolve. She was 50 feet above the desert floor, clinging to wet stone in the middle of a violent storm, with no guarantee that she could survive, even if she managed to reach the ground safely. But the alternative, returning to her luxurious prison, to await whatever fate Don Ricardo had planned for her, was worse than the physical danger she faced. Victoria forced herself to move along the ledge, using her fingertips to find handholds in the rough stone, while her feet searched for secure footing. The section of wall she had identified as climbable was perhaps 20 feet from the window. It seemed like 20 miles as she inched along the narrow ledge, with rain lashing her face and lightning turning the world into a stark black and white photograph. Twice she nearly lost her grip, saved only by desperation and the small knife she had driven into a crack in the stone to serve as an anchor point. When she finally reached the damaged section of wall, Victoria paused to catch her breath and assess her situation. The erosion had created a series of irregular handholds and footholds that descended toward the mesa's edge. From there, she would need to find a way down the cliff face to the desert floor, a descent that would be challenging, under the best conditions, and potentially suicidal in a thunderstorm. But there was no turning back now. Victoria began her descent, testing each handhold carefully before trusting her weight to it. The stone was treacherous with moisture, and more than once she felt rocks crumble away beneath her fingers. She forced herself to move slowly and deliberately, fighting the urge to hurry that might lead to a fatal mistake. Halfway down the wall, disaster struck. Her foot slipped on a wet stone, and she found herself dangling by her fingertips as her legs scrambled for purchase. For several terrifying seconds, she was certain she would fall to her death on the rocks below. But desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed, and she managed to find a new foothold just as her grip began to fail. The remainder of the descent passed in a blur of fear and determination. When Victoria's feet finally touched solid ground, she collapsed against the base of the wall and allowed herself a few moments to process what she had accomplished. She was outside the compound, free for the first time in months. But her escape was far from complete. The mesa that housed Casa del Sol rose several hundred feet above the desert floor, connected to the lower elevations by a winding trail that switchbacked down the cliff face. This trail was well maintained and regularly patrolled, making it unsuitable for a clandestine escape. Victoria would need to find another way down, a prospect that filled her with dread as lightning illuminated the sheer drops and jagged rocks that surrounded her position. She spent precious minutes exploring the mesa's edge, searching for any alternative to the main trail. Finally, she discovered a narrow ravine that cut into the cliff face, little more than a crack in the rock, but wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It appeared to descend toward the desert floor, though the darkness made it impossible to see how far it extended or whether it offered a viable route to safety. Victoria took a deep breath and committed herself to the unknown. She squeezed into the ravine, using her hands to feel for obstacles and her feet to test each step before shifting her weight. The walls of the narrow passage were slick with rainwater, and several times she found herself sliding uncontrollably before managing to arrest her descent by bracing herself against both sides of the ravine. The journey down seemed to take hours, though Victoria's terror-heightened senses made it difficult to judge time accurately. She encountered numerous obstacles, fallen rocks that blocked the passage, sections where the ravine narrowed to barely shoulder width, places where she had to lower herself hand over hand down near vertical drops. Each challenge tested her resolve and her physical capabilities to their limits. When she finally emerged from the ravine onto the desert floor, Victoria was exhausted, soaked, and bleeding from numerous cuts and scrapes. But she was alive, and she was free. The storm was beginning to move eastward, taking its fury with it and leaving behind the clean smell of wet earth and the promise of clear skies ahead. Victoria allowed herself only a brief rest before beginning the next phase of her escape. She needed to put as much distance as possible between herself and Casa del Sol before dawn revealed her absence. Don Ricardo's men would surely come after her, and they would have horses, local knowledge, and tracking skills that she couldn't hope to match. Her destination was Tombstone, the nearest town large enough to offer anonymity and the possibility of transportation to somewhere beyond Don Ricardo's reach. According to the maps she had studied in his library, Tombstone lay roughly 40 miles to the southeast, a distance that would take her at least 2 days to cover on foot across desert terrain. Victoria oriented herself using the North Star, visible now that the storm clouds were breaking apart, and began walking. Each step took her further from the nightmare of captivity and closer to an uncertain but self-determined future. She had no illusions about the dangers that lay ahead. The desert was merciless to the unprepared, and she was hardly equipped for a 40-mile journey across hostile terrain. Wild animals, extreme temperatures, lack of water, and the ever-present threat of pursuit all made her survival questionable. But for the first time in months, Victoria Hayes was in control of her own destiny. Whatever fate awaited her in the vast emptiness of the Arizona desert, it would be a fate of her own choosing. As she walked steadily southward under the clearing skies, she felt something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. It was fragile and tentative, like a candle flame in a strong wind, but it was real, and sometimes hope was enough to light the way through even the darkest wilderness. Behind her, Casa del Sol stood like a monument to wealth and power built on the suffering of others. Ahead lay the unknown desert, beautiful and terrible under the star-filled sky. Victoria pulled her makeshift cloak tighter against the cooling air and continued walking, each step carrying her further from the past and closer to whatever future awaited her in the wild lands ahead. The first light of dawn revealed the true magnitude of Victoria's undertaking. What had seemed like manageable desert terrain in the darkness now stretched endlessly in all directions, a harsh landscape of twisted cacti, jagged rocks, and sand that shimmered with an almost metallic quality in the early morning light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline clarity that made distant mountains appear close enough to touch, while simultaneously emphasizing their true remoteness. Victoria's clothing was still damp from the rain, which proved to be a blessing as the desert air began its daily transformation from cool to scorching. She had been walking for perhaps 6 hours, guided by the stars and her own determination, but now she needed to reassess her situation in the harsh light of reality. Her small supply of water was already diminished, and the dried fruit she had hoarded seemed pitifully inadequate for a journey that might take days. More concerning was the landscape itself. The maps in Don Ricardo's library had shown Tombstone as a relatively straightforward destination, but those maps had failed to capture the true complexity of the terrain. What appeared as empty space on paper was actually a maze of arroyos, rocky outcroppings, and thorny vegetation that forced constant detours and made straight-line travel impossible. Victoria climbed to the top of a small rise and surveyed her surroundings, trying to identify landmarks that might help her navigate. To the north, she could still see the distinctive silhouette of the mesa where Casa del Sol perched like an eagle's nest. The sight filled her with a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. Satisfaction that she had successfully escaped. Anxiety about how visible her position might be to anyone searching for her. As if summoned by her thoughts, she caught sight of dust clouds on the northern horizon. Even at this distance, the signs were unmistakable, riders moving at speed across the desert floor. Don Ricardo had discovered her absence and dispatched search parties to bring back his valuable investment. Victoria's heart raced as she calculated distances and possibilities. The riders were still several miles away, but they had horses and local knowledge, while she had only her feet and desperation. She needed to find cover, somewhere to hide until the immediate search passed, and then continue her journey under better circumstances. The rise where she stood offered little concealment, but perhaps a quarter-mile to the east, she spotted what appeared to be a cluster of large boulders that might provide shelter. Victoria abandoned the high ground and hurried toward this potential refuge, trying to balance speed with the need to avoid leaving obvious tracks in the sandy soil. The boulder formation proved to be larger than it had appeared from a distance, a jumbled collection of red sandstone rocks that had tumbled from some ancient cliff face, creating a natural maze of hiding places and shadows. Victoria squeezed between two of the largest boulders and found herself in a small chamber that was invisible from outside, but offered glimpses of the surrounding terrain through narrow gaps in the stone. From this vantage point, she watched the search party approach. There were 4 riders led by Carlos himself, and they moved with the systematic precision of men experienced in tracking fugitives. They paused at the rise where Victoria had recently stood, dismounting to examine the ground for signs of her passage. Victoria held her breath as Carlos pointed in various directions, apparently discussing the possible routes she might have taken. The other men spread out, following different trails and examining the terrain with the careful attention of professional trackers. For several terrifying minutes, one of the riders approached the boulder field where she was hiding, close enough that she could hear his horse's breathing and the jingle of his spurs. But the search party was working against time as well as terrain. Don Ricardo would want his property recovered quickly before word of her escape could spread or before she could reach help in one of the distant settlements. After perhaps 30 minutes of fruitless searching, Carlos called his men back, and they remounted, heading southeast toward the main trail to Tombstone. Victoria remained hidden for another hour after the dust of their passage had settled, using the time to rest and plan her next moves. The search party's direction told her that Carlos assumed she was heading for Tombstone, a logical assumption that was unfortunately correct. She would need to alter her route, perhaps swing wide to the west before turning south, adding miles to her journey, but hopefully avoiding the obvious paths that Don Ricardo's men would be watching. When she finally emerged from her rocky shelter, the sun was climbing toward its merciless zenith, and the temperature was beginning its daily assault on anything foolish enough to be caught in the open desert. Victoria wrapped her makeshift cloak around her head and shoulders, creating a crude but essential protection against the solar furnace above. The western detour took her through terrain that was even more challenging than what she had encountered during the night. Here the desert revealed its malevolent diversity, forests of cholla cactus that could cripple the unwary, hidden arroyos that dropped away without warning, and stretches of loose sand that made every step an exhausting effort. Victoria's soft hands, accustomed to turning pages and pouring tea, quickly became raw and bleeding from contact with thorns and rough stone. But perhaps the most dangerous enemy was the heat itself. As the sun reached its peak, the temperature soared beyond anything Victoria had experienced, even during the hottest Texas summers. The air shimmered with visible waves of thermal energy, and the metal buckle of her improvised belt became too hot to touch. Her small water supply, carefully rationed though it was, disappeared with alarming speed as her body fought to cool itself through perspiration. By mid-afternoon, Victoria was beginning to understand why the desert had claimed so many lives over the centuries. This was not merely harsh weather, it was an actively hostile environment that attacked human physiology at its most fundamental level. Her head pounded with the beginnings of heat exhaustion, her mouth felt lined with cotton, and strange shadows began dancing at the edges of her vision. She forced herself to seek shelter during the worst heat of the day, finding a narrow overhang of rock that provided a few feet of blessed shade. Here, she rationed herself a tiny sip of water and tried to rest while her body temperature slowly returned to manageable levels. But rest was a luxury she could barely afford. Every hour of delay increased the chances that Don Ricardo's men would intercept her, or that the desert itself would claim her life. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Victoria resumed her journey. The temperature remained brutal, but the angle of the sunlight made travel marginally more bearable. She had been walking for nearly 24 hours now, with only brief rests, and exhaustion was becoming as dangerous as the heat. Her legs felt leaden, her coordination was suffering, and she found herself stumbling over obstacles that should have been easily avoided. It was during one of these stumbles that Victoria first became aware she was being watched. The sensation started as nothing more than a prickling at the back of her neck, the kind of primitive warning that had kept her ancestors alive in dangerous times. She paused in the shadow of a large saguaro cactus and carefully scanned her surroundings, but saw nothing unusual. Just the endless expanse of desert landscape that had surrounded her all day. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger rather than fading. Someone or something was observing her movements, tracking her progress across the wasteland. Victoria's first thought was that Carlos had somehow flanked her position and was preparing to capture her, but a more careful examination of the terrain revealed no obvious hiding places for mounted men. As the light continued to fade, turning the desert into a canvas of deep purples and burning oranges, Victoria caught her first glimpse of her watcher. A figure stood silhouetted against the sky, on a distant ridge, motionless as the rock formations around him. At this distance, she could make out little detail, but something about the person's posture and positioning suggested this was not one of Don Ricardo's men. The figure observed her for perhaps 10 minutes before melting away into the landscape, with such fluid grace that Victoria wondered if she had imagined the entire encounter. But she was certain someone had been there, someone who moved through this harsh environment with a skill that spoke of lifelong familiarity with its dangers and opportunities. As full darkness descended, Victoria found herself facing a critical decision. She could continue traveling by night, when the temperature was more manageable, but navigation was difficult and dangerous, or she could seek shelter and rest until dawn, risking discovery by search parties, but preserving her strength for the challenges ahead. The decision was made for her when she stumbled into a dry creek bed and felt her ankle twist on the uneven stones. The injury wasn't severe, but it was enough to make her realize how close she was to complete exhaustion. Victoria found a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging bank and allowed herself to collapse onto the sand. For the first time since beginning her escape, she permitted herself to fully acknowledge the magnitude of what she was attempting. She was a young woman with no desert survival skills, minimal supplies, and no clear understanding of how far she still had to travel. The odds of reaching Tombstone alive were poor at best, and even if she survived the journey, there was no guarantee she would find help or safety there. But as she lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the desert awakening around her, Victoria found her resolve strengthening rather than weakening. She had chosen this desperate gamble over the certainty of continued captivity, and she would see it through regardless of the consequences. Better to die free in the wilderness than to live as Don Ricardo's property, waiting for whatever fate he eventually chose for her. The night brought new challenges, but also unexpected comforts. The temperature dropped to manageable levels, and a light breeze carried the scent of distant rain. More importantly, Victoria discovered that the desert night was far from empty. Small creatures moved through the darkness, desert mice, kit, foxes, and other animals that had adapted to this harsh environment. Their presence was oddly reassuring, proof that life could indeed flourish even in the most inhospitable places. As she dozed fitfully in her sandy shelter, Victoria became aware of another presence nearby. Not the small desert creatures that had been her companions throughout the evening, but something larger and more purposeful. She opened her eyes and lay perfectly still, trying to locate the source of her unease. A shadow detached itself from the darkness near the opposite bank of the creek bed. At first, Victoria thought it might be a large animal, a mountain lion or bear that had come to investigate the unusual scent of human presence. But as her eyes adjusted to the starlight, she realized she was looking at a man. He stood perhaps 20 feet away, motionless as a statue, studying her with an intensity she could feel even in the darkness. This was her watcher from the ridge, she realized, the mysterious figure who'd been tracking her progress across the desert. But unlike Don Ricardo's men, this person radiated no sense of immediate threat. Instead, there was something almost protective about his presence, as if he were a guardian rather than a predator. Victoria remained frozen, uncertain whether to call out, run, or simply wait to see what the stranger would do. The decision was taken from her when the man stepped forward into a patch of starlight, revealing features that were unmistakably Apache. high cheekbones, dark skin, and long black hair bound with a leather thong. He was dressed in traditional clothing rather than the European-style garments favored by most Native Americans who lived near white settlements. More intriguingly, when the man opened his mouth as if to speak, no sound emerged. He tried again, touching his throat with obvious frustration, and Victoria realized with a shock that he was mute. This was no ordinary Apache warrior, but someone whose silence had been imposed by injury or birth defect, setting him apart from his own people just as surely as Victoria had been set apart from hers. The two outcasts stared at each other across the narrow creek bed, each recognizing something familiar in the other's eyes. Both were alone in the vast desert. Both were fugitives from lives they had not chosen, and both understood what it meant to be powerless in a world that valued only strength and conformity. Without speaking, for neither could communicate in conventional ways, they had found each other in the wilderness. And in that moment of recognition, Victoria's desperate flight toward an uncertain future took on an entirely new dimension. The silence stretched between Victoria and the Apache, warrior for what felt like an eternity, each studying the other with the cautious intensity of wild animals meeting at a waterhole. In the pale starlight, Victoria could see that he was younger than she had first assumed, perhaps 30 years old, with the lean, muscular build of someone who had spent his entire life moving through harsh terrain. His clothes were practical, rather than ceremonial, leather leggings, a simple cloth shirt, and moccasins that would make no sound on stone or sand. Most remarkably, his eyes held an intelligence and depth that reminded Victoria of the scholars she had encountered in her father's bookshop back in Millbrook. This was not the savage that frontier newspapers loved to describe, but a man of obvious education and refinement, albeit one shaped by a completely different culture than her own. The Apache made a gesture with his hands, a flowing movement that seemed to convey both greeting and question. When Victoria failed to respond, he tried again, this time pointing to himself and then to her, his expression indicating that he was attempting some form of communication, despite his inability to speak. Victoria cleared her throat softly, not wanting to startle him, but recognizing that the standoff could not continue indefinitely. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the desert stillness. "I'm sorry, but I don't know your language." The Apache tilted his head, considering her words, then slowly approached the edge of the creek bed. He knelt and began drawing in the sand with his finger, creating simple symbols illuminated by the starlight. First he drew what appeared to be a crude map, lines representing the creek, marks for various landmarks, and finally a small circle that he pointed to repeatedly while gesturing toward Victoria. Understanding dawned slowly. He was showing her where she was, helping her orient herself in the vast landscape. Victoria felt a mixture of gratitude and wariness. Why would a stranger, an Apache warrior no less, offer assistance to a white woman fleeing through his people's territory as... If sensing her confusion, the Apache continued his sandy sketches. He drew what Victoria eventually recognized as Casa del Sol, a square perched on a mesa, with smaller figures around it representing mounted men. Then he drew a path leading away from the compound, with marks that seemed to indicate Victoria's route through the desert. Finally, he drew other figures, clearly more mounted men, positioned along the obvious trail to Tombstone. The message was clear. He had been watching not only Victoria, but also her pursuers. He knew about the search parties, understood her desperate situation, and was warning her about the dangers ahead. But why? The Apache set aside his sandy map and reached into a leather pouch at his waist, withdrawing what appeared to be a small piece of dried meat. He offered it to Victoria, with a gesture that transcended language barriers, the universal symbol of shared sustenance. When she hesitated, He took a small bite himself, demonstrating that the food was safe. Victoria's stomach cramped with hunger as she accepted the offering. The meat was tough and heavily seasoned with unfamiliar spices, but it was the first substantial food she had tasted since beginning her escape. As she chewed gratefully, the Apache produced a water gourd and offered it as well. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but to Victoria's parched throat it was more precious than wine. "Thank you," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear the words. Instead, she tried to convey her gratitude through gestures, pressing her palms together and bowing her head slightly. The Apache acknowledged her thanks with a brief nod, then returned to his sandy drawings. This time, he sketched a different route, one that swung far to the west before curving back toward the south. It would add considerable distance to Victoria's journey, but it would also avoid the areas where Don Ricardo's men were likely to be searching. More intriguingly, the Apache drew symbols along this alternate route, marks that seemed to indicate water sources, shelter, and safe passage. He was not merely warning her about dangers, he was offering to guide her to safety. Victoria stared at the crude map, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. Why would this man, this stranger from a culture that had every reason to view whites as enemies, risk his own safety to help her? What did he hope to gain from such an alliance? As if reading her thoughts, the Apache began a new series of drawings. These were more complex, almost pictographic in nature. He drew a large building, not unlike Casa del Sol, but different in architectural style. Around this building, he sketched multiple figures, some clearly meant to represent women. Then he drew lines connecting these women to mounted men, suggesting some form of transaction or exchange. Victoria's blood ran cold as she began to understand. The Apache was indicating that he knew about Don Ricardo's business. The trafficking of women, the forced servitude disguised as employment, the entire criminal enterprise that had made Victoria herself a commodity to be bought and sold. But how could he know such details unless... The Apache drew one final symbol, a small bag with lines radiating from it, clearly meant to represent gold or coins. Then he pointed to himself and made a gesture that Victoria interpreted as rejection or refusal. He had been offered gold for something or someone and had turned it down. Understanding struck Victoria like a physical blow. This man had been approached by Don Ricardo or his associates, perhaps offering payment to capture escaped women or to provide information about Apache movements in the area. But he had refused to participate in their schemes, choosing instead to help their victims. The implications were staggering. If the Apache could be trusted, and Victoria was beginning to believe he could, then he represented not just salvation from her immediate predicament, but also someone who understood the true nature of what she had escaped. He was offering an alliance based on shared opposition to Don Ricardo's evil enterprise. Victoria looked up from the sandy drawings to find the Apache watching her intently, waiting for her decision. She could see that he understood her hesitation, recognized the enormous leap of faith required to trust a stranger in such desperate circumstances. But she could also see something else in his expression, a depth of compassion that reminded her that mercy and honor were not limited to any single culture or race. "Yes," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her voice. Instead, she nodded firmly and pointed to the alternate route he had sketched, then to herself, indicating her willingness to follow his guidance. The Apache's relief was visible, though he quickly masked it with practical concerns. He erased his sandy maps with broad sweeps of his hand, then gestured for Victoria to gather her meager belongings. It was clear that they needed to move immediately, before dawn made travel more dangerous and more visible to searching eyes. As Victoria prepared to leave her sandy shelter, the Apache disappeared into the darkness with the same fluid grace she had observed earlier. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined the entire encounter, if desperation and exhaustion had created a hallucination of rescue where none existed. But then he reappeared, leading a horse that seemed to materialize from the shadows like something conjured from dreams. The animal was a small, sturdy mare with the compact build and sure footing that marked her as bred for desert travel. Her coat was a deep brown that would blend into the landscape, and her movements suggested the kind of endurance that could carry riders across vast distances without faltering. Most remarkably, she made almost no sound as she moved, her hooves finding purchase on stone and sand with the delicate precision of a dancer. The Apache helped Victoria mount the horse, his touch respectful but firm as he ensured she was securely seated. He then swung up behind her with a fluid motion that spoke of lifelong familiarity with mounted travel. Victoria found herself surrounded by his presence, his arms reaching around her to grasp the reins, his body providing warmth against the cool desert night, his steady breathing creating a rhythm that gradually calmed her racing heart. They rode in silence through the darkness, the Apache guiding their mount with subtle shifts in weight and gentle pressure on the reins. Victoria marveled at his skill in navigating terrain that was nearly invisible to her eyes. He seemed to know every stone, every arroyo, every patch of soft sand that might cause difficulties. More than once, he guided the horse around obstacles that Victoria didn't even see until they were already past. The route he had sketched in the sand proved to be even more complex in reality. They wound through narrow canyons where the walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, crossed rocky plateaus where a single misstep could mean disaster, and descended into valleys so deep that the stars seemed impossibly distant overhead. Through it all, the Apache maintained their course with unwavering confidence, as if following a map written in his memory rather than on any piece of paper. As they traveled, Victoria found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of her situation. The Apache's presence was deeply reassuring, not just because of his obvious skill and knowledge, but because of something more fundamental. He radiated a sense of honor and trustworthiness that reminded her of the best men she had known in her former life, like her father before alcohol claimed him, like the rare customers in their bookshop who had treated knowledge as sacred rather than merely useful. Dawn found them in a hidden canyon that the Apache had clearly used as a campsite before. A small spring emerged from the rock wall, creating a pool of clear water surrounded by grass and small trees that seemed miraculous after the harsh landscape they had been traveling through. The Apache helped Victoria dismount, then led the horse to drink while she knelt beside the spring and splashed water on her face and hands. The simple act of washing away the dust and grime of her escape felt like a form of baptism, a symbolic cleansing that marked the transition from her desperate flight to something approaching hope. Victoria caught sight of her reflection in the still water and was startled by what she saw. The pampered young woman who had been Don Ricardo's captive was gone, replaced by someone harder and more determined. Her green eyes held depths they hadn't possessed before, and her face showed the kind of strength that came only from surviving genuine hardship. When she looked up from the water, Victoria found the Apache studying her with an expression that might have been approval. He had built a small fire using techniques that produced almost no smoke and was preparing what appeared to be a simple meal from supplies hidden in the canyon walls. The efficiency of his movements suggested that this hidden refuge was one of many such places scattered across his territory, a network of safe havens that allowed him to move through the desert like a ghost. As they shared the morning meal in comfortable silence, Victoria found herself wondering about her mysterious rescuer's story. What circumstances had left him mute? How had he learned about Don Ricardo's criminal activities? Why had he chosen to help her when doing so clearly put him at considerable risk? But more immediately, she wondered about their destination. The Apache had indicated that he was taking her to safety, but what form would that safety take? Were there other Apache who would accept her presence, or was he planning to guide her all the way to Tombstone and the uncertain protection of white civilization? The answers to these questions would have to wait. For now, it was enough that she was alive, that she had found an ally in the vast wilderness, and that she was moving steadily away from the nightmare of Casa del Sol. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Victoria felt more prepared to face them than she had since the terrible day when Marcus had sold her freedom for gold. As the Apache extinguished the fire and prepared their horse for the next stage of the journey, Victoria offered a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever forces had brought them together. In a world that had shown her mostly cruelty and betrayal, she had found kindness in the most unexpected place. It was a reminder that hope could flourish even in the harshest circumstances, and that sometimes salvation came from the most unlikely sources. They traveled for 3 more days through a landscape that seemed to exist outside of time itself. The Apache, whom Victoria had begun thinking of as her guardian, though she still didn't know his name, guided them through hidden valleys and forgotten canyons that showed no trace of white settlement or even regular human passage. This was ancient Apache territory, sacred ground where his people had hunted and gathered for countless generations before the arrival of Spanish conquistadors or American settlers. Each evening, they would make camp in carefully chosen locations that offered water, shelter, and concealment from potential enemies. The Apache's knowledge of these hidden refugees seemed unlimited. He would lead them to springs concealed behind rockfalls, to caves decorated with pictographs left by his ancestors, to groves of mesquite trees that provided both food and shade. In the midst of seemingly barren wasteland, during these quiet interludes, Victoria began to understand more about her rescuer through observation and the gradual development of their own wordless communication system. He was clearly a man of high standing among his people, despite his handicap. The weapons he carried, a rifle, a bow, and several knives, were of exceptional quality, decorated with silver inlay and intricate leatherwork that spoke of both wealth and artistry. His horse, too, showed signs of careful breeding and training that suggested its owner was no ordinary warrior. More intriguingly, the Apache demonstrated a familiarity with white culture that went beyond mere contact with traders or soldiers. When they encountered obstacles that required written communication, a warning sign posted by miners, for instance, or a map carved into a rock face by previous travelers, he could clearly read and understand English. This suggested an education that few Indians of his generation had been permitted to receive. Victoria found herself developing a deep respect for his intelligence and resourcefulness. He seemed to anticipate problems before they arose, always choosing routes that avoided both natural hazards and human threats. When they encountered other travelers at a distance, a mining expedition heading north, a military patrol following an established trail, he would guide them to concealment long before detection became possible. On the 4th morning of their journey together, they crested a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the valley beyond, and Victoria gasped at what she saw. Spread below them was an Apache settlement unlike anything she had imagined from the sensationalized accounts in frontier newspapers. Instead of the primitive encampment she had expected, she found herself looking at a sophisticated community that blended traditional Native American architecture with adaptations clearly influenced by contact with Mexican and American cultures. The central area consisted of traditional wickiups, dome-shaped structures made from wooden frames covered with brush and hides, but these were supplemented by more permanent buildings. Constructed from adobe and stone, gardens flourished in carefully irrigated plots, growing corn, beans, and squash alongside native plants that Victoria didn't recognize. Horses grazed in corrals that showed expert craftsmanship, and the overall impression was of a people who had successfully adapted to changing circumstances without abandoning their essential identity. Children played in the dusty spaces between buildings, while women worked at various tasks, weaving baskets, preparing food, tending gardens. Men could be seen maintaining weapons, caring for horses, and engaged in what appeared to be serious discussions near the largest of the adobe structures. The scene was one of ordered prosperity rather than the desperate poverty that government agents and newspaper reporters claimed characterized all Indian settlements. As they descended toward the village, Victoria became aware of the attention. Their approach was generating. Work ceased as people emerged from buildings to watch the arrival of the mute warrior and his unexpected companion. Victoria felt the weight of dozens of eyes examining her, evaluating this white woman who had somehow gained the protection of one of their most respected members. The Apache guided their horse directly to the largest building, which Victoria realized must serve as some kind of community center or council house. An elderly man emerged from the doorway, clearly a leader, given the deference shown him by the others who had gathered. His hair was white with age, but his bearing remained straight and proud. He wore traditional Apache clothing, enhanced with silver ornaments and turquoise jewelry that spoke of both wealth and status. The old chief, for that was clearly what he was, approached them with measured steps, his dark eyes never leaving Victoria's face. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of long leadership and the wisdom of many years. "Why do you bring this white woman to our village, Silent Wolf?" he asked, addressing the mute Apache in heavily accented but clear English. "Do you not know the danger her presence brings to our people?" Silent Wolf, Victoria finally had a name for her rescuer, even if it was translated, dismounted and helped her down from the horse. He then began an elaborate series of hand gestures that Victoria realized must be sign language, a method of communication she had heard existed among Plains Indians, but had never witnessed firsthand. The conversation that followed was entirely visual from Silent Wolf's side, but Victoria could read the emotional content even without understanding the specific gestures. He was explaining her circumstances, describing her escape from Don Ricardo's compound, and making some kind of argument for allowing her to remain in the village. The chief's expression shifted from skepticism to interest, to what might have been sympathy as the story unfolded. Other villagers had gathered in a loose circle around them, listening to their leader's side of the conversation, while watching Silent Wolf's gestures with obvious understanding. Victoria realized that sign language must be common knowledge in this community, probably developed to accommodate Silent Wolf's disability, but useful for other situations requiring silent communication. When Silent Wolf finished his explanation, the chief studied Victoria for a long moment before speaking again. "You are the woman from the fortress on the mesa," he said, addressing her directly. "The one the Mexican keeps as his prized possession." Victoria started, surprised not only that he knew about her situation, but that he referred to Don Ricardo as the Mexican rather than using his name. "You know about Don Ricardo Mendoza?" she asked. The chief's expression darkened. "We know of the man who trades in human flesh, who buys women like cattle and sells them to the highest bidder. We know of his fortress and his guards and his business with the worst elements of both our peoples." He paused, studying her face. "What we did not know was that one of his captives would prove brave enough to escape and wise enough to trust. An Apache warrior for protection." Victoria felt a surge of hope. If these people understood the nature of her captivity, if they recognized Don Ricardo as an enemy rather than simply a white man conducting legitimate business, then perhaps they would indeed offer her sanctuary. "Silent Wolf says you seek passage to the white town called Tombstone," the chief continued, "but he also says that men hunt you. that your former captor will not give up his property easily. These men will follow your trail, and when they cannot find you among the whites, they will come looking here." The implications were clear, and Victoria felt her heart sink. By seeking refuge among the Apache, she was bringing danger to people who had already suffered enough from white aggression and government persecution. Whatever safety they offered her came at a cost that she wasn't sure she had the right to. "Ask them to pay. I understand," she said quietly. "I don't want to bring trouble to your people. If you can just point me toward Tombstone, I'll continue on my own." The chief smiled for the first time since her arrival, and the expression transformed his weathered features entirely. "You misunderstand, young woman. I am not refusing to help you. I'm explaining why we must be very careful about how we provide that help." He gestured toward the assembled villagers, many of whom Victoria now realized were watching her with expressions of sympathy rather than hostility. These people understand what it means to be hunted, to be treated as less than human by those who claim superiority. Your skin may be white, but your circumstances make you one of us, a refugee seeking justice and freedom. Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes at the unexpected acceptance. After months of being treated as property, as something to be bought and sold according to the whims of men like Marcus and Don Ricardo, she was being offered genuine human fellowship by people she had been taught to fear. "There is more," the chief continued. "The Mexicans' business threatens not only individual women, but the safety of our entire community. He has approached some of our young warriors, offering gold in exchange for information about white travelers, about army patrols, about the movements of our people. He seeks to make us accomplices in his crimes." Victoria understood now why Silent Wolf had drawn the picture of gold being rejected. The Apache community had been faced with the same choice that had destroyed her brother, the choice between easy money and moral integrity. And like Marcus, they had chosen honor over profit. "Most of our warriors rejected his offers," the chief said, echoing her thoughts. "But not all. Gold speaks loudly to young men who see their traditional ways of life disappearing, who watch their people being driven onto reservations and treated like prisoners. The Mexicans' corruption threatens to divide our community, to turn some of our own people into hunters of the innocent." The political implications were staggering. Don Ricardo wasn't just running a criminal enterprise. He was actively working to corrupt Apache society, to turn proud warriors into collaborators in human trafficking. The man's evil ran deeper than Victoria had imagined, extending beyond individual victims to threaten entire communities. "So you see," the chief concluded, "helping you serves our interests as well as yours. Every blow against the Mexicans' operation weakens his influence over our people and demonstrates that his gold cannot buy Apache honor." Silent Wolf stepped forward and began another series of hand gestures, these apparently more urgent than his previous communications. The chief listened intently, occasionally asking questions that Silent Wolf answered with increasingly elaborate sign language. "Silent Wolf proposes a plan," the chief finally announced. "It is dangerous, but it offers the possibility of solving multiple problems at once." He turned to Victoria with an expression that mixed anticipation with concern. "Are you willing to take considerable risks if it means not only ensuring your own freedom, but also striking a blow against the man who held you captive?" Victoria felt her pulse quicken. Whatever Silent Wolf had in mind, it clearly went beyond simply escaping to Tombstone and hoping for the best. This was something more ambitious, more dangerous, but potentially more decisive. "What kind of plan?" she asked. The chief smiled again, but this time the expression held something predatory. "The kind that requires considerable courage, perfect timing, and a willingness to trust in Apache justice, the kind that might teach the Mexican that some people cannot be bought, some spirits cannot be broken, and some crimes demand immediate and decisive punishment. Victoria looked at Silent Wolf, seeing in his golden eyes the same fierce determination that had sustained her through her escape from Casa del Sol. Whatever he was proposing, it would be perilous beyond anything she had yet experienced. But it would also be her chance to transform herself from victim to active participant in her own salvation. "Tell me what you need me to do," she said firmly. The chief nodded approvingly. "First, you must understand that once we begin this course of action, there will be no retreat, no second chances. You will be committed to seeing it through regardless of the consequences." Victoria thought of the women who had occupied her position before her, of the girls who might be brought to Casa del Sol in the future if Don Ricardo's operation continued unchecked. She thought of the Apache warriors being tempted by gold to betray their own values, of the corruption spreading through both communities like a cancer. "I understand," she said, "and I'm ready." The chief's smile broadened, and for the first time, since her capture, Victoria felt like she was truly among allies, rather than merely seeking temporary refuge. Whatever lay ahead would be dangerous, but it would also be purposeful. She was no longer simply running from evil, she was preparing to fight back against it. The plan that emerged during the council meeting that evening was audacious beyond anything Victoria could have imagined. As she sat in the flickering firelight, surrounded by Apache elders and warriors whose weathered faces spoke of countless battles and hard-won wisdom, she listened to a strategy that would have seemed impossible just days earlier, when she was still a captive at Casa del Sol. The chief, who had introduced himself as Iron Bear, spoke with the measured cadence of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "The Mexican believes himself untouchable in his mountain fortress," he said, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "His arrogance has grown with his wealth, and he no longer takes proper precautions against those he considers beneath his notice." Silent Wolf had spent the afternoon providing detailed intelligence about Don Ricardo's compound, using a combination of sign language and carefully drawn maps in the dirt. His knowledge was remarkably comprehensive. The number of guards, their patrol schedules, the layout of buildings, the location of weapons and supplies, even the personal habits of Don Ricardo himself. How does he know so much about the compound? Victoria had asked Iron Bear during a break in the planning session. The old chief had smiled grimly. Silent Wolf was not always welcome in our village. As a young man, his anger over his disability and his frustration with our people's forced accommodation to white expansion led him to seek alternative paths. He worked for various employers, including the Mexican, gathering information and tracking fugitives. Victoria felt a chill of apprehension. He worked for Don Ricardo? For a time, yes. But unlike others who were corrupted by gold, Silent Wolf saw the true nature of the Mexican's business. When he was ordered to track down a young Navajo woman who had escaped from the compound, he instead helped her reach safety with her own people. The Mexican's anger was considerable. Iron Bear had gestured towards Silent Wolf's throat. His muteness is not from birth or accident. It is the result of the Mexican's displeasure when he discovered Silent Wolf's betrayal. The revelation had shaken Victoria profoundly. Don Ricardo had deliberately destroyed Silent Wolf's ability to speak, marking him permanently for his act of defiance. The cruelty was breathtaking even by Don Ricardo's standards, and it explained the depth of Silent Wolf's commitment to destroying his former employer's operation. Now, as the council session continued into the night, Victoria began to understand her role in the complex plan taking shape. She would not be merely a rescued victim seeking safety. She would be the key element in a strategy designed to bring down Don Ricardo's entire criminal enterprise. The Mexican's weakness is his pride, Iron Bear explained. He cannot bear the thought that his valuable property has escaped and found protection among people he considers savages. When he learns that you are here, safe under Apache protection, his rage will overcome his caution. The plan relied on this psychological insight. Rather than hiding Victoria or spiriting her away to distant safety, they would ensure that Don Ricardo learned exactly where she was. The message would be crafted to inflame his pride and challenge his authority in the most provocative way possible. "But he'll come with an army," Victoria protested. "He has dozens of men, heavily armed. Attacking this village would be—" "Exactly what we want him to attempt," Iron Bear interrupted. "The Mexican's strength lies in his ability to operate from his fortress, using isolation and superior firepower to maintain control. But if we can draw him out, force him to fight on ground of our choosing, his advantages disappear." The tactical brilliance of the plan became clear as Iron Bear continued his explanation. The Apache had chosen their village location carefully, in a valley that appeared open and defensible, but was actually surrounded by hidden positions and escape routes known only to the tribe. Any attacking force would find itself channeled into killing zones while the defenders melted away into terrain that offered countless opportunities for ambush and harassment. More importantly, Iron Bear added, the Mexican cannot attack an Apache village without involving the territorial government and the army. Such an action would expose his criminal activities to authorities who have thus far chosen to ignore his operations. He will need to act quickly and quietly, which means he cannot bring his full strength to bear. Victoria began to see the elegance of the strategy. Don Ricardo would be forced to choose between accepting the loss of his property, an intolerable blow to his pride, or risking everything on a hasty attack that would expose him to legal consequences and tactical disadvantages. "What about the women still at the compound?" Victoria asked. "If he abandons Casa del Sol to attack the village, what happens to them?" Silent Wolf had an answer for this concern as well. Through his sign language, translated by Iron Bear, he explained that the attack on the village would be a diversion. While Don Ricardo focused his attention and most of his men on retrieving Victoria, a separate Apache force would infiltrate the compound and free any remaining captives. "The timing must be perfect," Iron Bear acknowledged, "and the risks are considerable. But if we succeed, we will not only free you and the other women, but also destroy the Mexican's ability to continue his criminal operations." The personal dimension of the plan was equally important. By demonstrating that Apache warriors could successfully challenge Don Ricardo's power, they would send a message to other criminal enterprises that Native Americans were not helpless, victims to be exploited at will. It would also prove to their own young men that honor and traditional values were more powerful than the easy gold offered by corrupt whites. Victoria felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The plan's success depended largely on her ability to play her role convincingly when the crucial moment arrived. She would need to appear vulnerable enough to justify Don Ricardo's confidence, while actually being prepared to fight for her life when the trap was sprung. The next 3 days were spent in intensive preparation. Victoria learned basic Apache fighting techniques from the village women, who proved to be formidable warriors in their own right. She practiced with knives and war clubs, developed skills in moving silently through difficult terrain, and learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of enemies or allies. More importantly, she began to understand Apache culture and values in ways that her sheltered upbringing had never allowed. These were not the savage primitives portrayed in frontier newspapers, but sophisticated people with complex social structures, deep spiritual beliefs, and a profound connection to the land that sustained them. The women of the village, initially suspicious of the white stranger in their midst, gradually accepted Victoria as she demonstrated her commitment to their cause and her willingness to share their dangers. They taught her practical skills: how to find water in the desert, how to identify edible plants, how to move without leaving tracks that enemies could follow. But perhaps most valuable was the psychological preparation they provided. These women had all lived with the constant threat of violence, had all lost family members to wars and raids and government persecution. They understood the kind of courage required to face overwhelming odds, and they helped Victoria develop the mental toughness she would need for the challenges ahead. Silent Wolf spent these days refining the tactical details of their plan. He scouted the approaches to the village, identified the best positions for ambushes, and coordinated with the warriors who would be responsible for the simultaneous attack on Casa del Sol. His intimate knowledge of Don Ricardo's methods and resources proved invaluable in anticipating problems and developing contingency plans. Victoria found herself developing a deeper appreciation for Silent Wolf's character during these intense preparation sessions. Despite his inability to speak, he communicated with remarkable clarity through sign language, facial expressions, and the eloquent gestures that seemed to come naturally to him. His intelligence was formidable, his tactical sense exceptional, and his dedication to justice unwavering. More personally, Victoria began to recognize the depth of feeling that had motivated his decision to help her. This was not merely compassion for a fellow victim or strategic thinking about weakening a common enemy. Silent Wolf's commitment to her welfare had a personal dimension that transcended simple alliance or mutual benefit. The realization came gradually through small gestures and unguarded moments when his feelings showed clearly in his golden eyes. He cared for her not just as a symbol of resistance to Don Ricardo's tyranny, but as a woman whose strength and courage had earned his respect, and something deeper, something that might be called love, though neither of them had spoken the word. Victoria found herself responding to this unspoken affection with feelings that surprised her in their intensity. Silent Wolf represented everything that the men in her former life had lacked: integrity, courage, genuine respect for her as a person rather than as property. His silence, which might have been seen as a disability, had become a form of communication, more honest and meaningful than all the smooth words spoken by men like Don Ricardo and Marcus. On the evening before their plan was to be set in motion, Victoria and Silent Wolf walked together through the village as the sun set behind the distant mountains. The familiar sounds of domestic life surrounded them: children playing, women singing as they worked, men discussing the next day's activities around small fires. Without words, they both understood that this might be their last peaceful evening. Together, the plan they had devised was dangerous for everyone involved, but particularly for Victoria, who would be at the center of the coming conflict. If things went wrong, if Don Ricardo proved more cunning or more ruthless than they anticipated, she might not survive to see another sunset. Silent Wolf stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious but tender. He reached into a leather pouch at his waist and withdrew something that glinted in the fading light: a small bag made of soft deer skin, tied with sinew and decorated with intricate beadwork. Victoria accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly. The bag was heavier than its size suggested, and when she opened it, she gasped at what she found inside. Gold coins, Spanish pieces of 8 and American eagles, filled the small container. There was enough wealth here to buy passage to anywhere in the world, to start a new life far from the dangers and conflicts of the southwestern territories. She looked up at Silent Wolf in confusion, and he began a series of hand gestures that took several minutes to complete. When he finished, Victoria understood both the practical and symbolic meaning of his gift. The gold had come from Don Ricardo himself, payment for services that Silent Wolf had never actually performed, money he had been given in advance for. Tracking fugitives and gathering intelligence. By giving it to Victoria, he was symbolically returning it to one of Don Ricardo's victims while providing her with the means to achieve true freedom, regardless of how their plan concluded. But the gesture meant even more than that. In Apache culture, Silent Wolf explained through signs. Such a gift between a man and woman carried implications of the deepest commitment. He was offering not just gold, but his protection, his loyalty, and his heart for as long as both of them lived. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face as she understood the full meaning of what he was offering. Here was a man who had lost everything: his voice, his place in white society, even his standing among his own people for a time, yet was willing to risk what remained for her sake. The contrast with Marcus, who had sold her for his own benefit, could not have been more stark. She closed the bag of gold and pressed it back into Silent Wolf's hands, then reached up to touch his face gently. Through her own improvised gestures, she tried to convey that his offer was accepted not for the gold it contained, but for the love it represented. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together as partners in a struggle that had become larger than either of their individual fates. As night fell over the Apache village, Victoria and Silent Wolf stood together under the vast canopy of desert stars, each drawing strength from the other for the battle that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring danger beyond anything either of them had previously faced, but it would also bring the opportunity to strike a decisive blow against the forces of corruption and cruelty that had shaped both their lives. The game of cat and mouse that had begun with Victoria's escape from Casa del Sol was about to reach its climactic conclusion. The messenger arrived at Casa del Sol 3 days later, just as Iron Bear had predicted. Victoria watched from a concealed position on a ridge overlooking the compound as the lone Apache rider approached the gates under a white flag of truce. The timing was perfect. Late afternoon, when the desert heat made everyone sluggish, and Don Ricardo would be in his study reviewing the day's business correspondence. From her vantage point nearly a mile away, Victoria could see the controlled chaos that erupted within the compound walls as guards scrambled to respond to this unexpected development. Through the telescope that Silent Wolf had provided, she watched Don Ricardo himself emerge from the main house, his posture radiating the kind of fury that she remembered all too well from her captivity. The message the Apache rider delivered was carefully crafted to inflame every aspect of Don Ricardo's pride and greed. Written in Spanish on quality paper that suggested Apache literacy and sophistication, it was respectful in tone but devastating in content. The translation, which Iron Bear had shared with Victoria before the messenger departed, was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. To Don Ricardo Mendoza, from Iron Bear, chief of the Mountain Apache, we return to you news of your lost property. The woman, Victoria Hayes, has found sanctuary among our people, where she tells remarkable stories of her treatment at Casa del Sol. We are curious about the white man's customs that permit the buying and selling of women like cattle. Perhaps you would care to visit our village to explain these customs to our young warriors, who are eager to learn such profitable enterprises. The message concluded with precise directions to the Apache village, along with an invitation to bring whatever force you deem necessary to reclaim your property. The insult was carefully calculated, suggesting that Don Ricardo needed to explain himself to savages implying that the Apache were considering adopting his criminal methods and challenging his ability to take back what he considered his rightful possession. Victoria knew that Don Ricardo's response would be swift and overwhelming. The man's entire identity was built on the perception of absolute power within his domain. Any challenge to that authority, especially from people he considered racially inferior, would trigger a reaction as predictable as sunrise. She didn't have to wait long. Within 2 hours of the messenger's departure, Victoria could see frantic activity throughout the compound. Horses were being saddled, weapons distributed, and supplies packed with the efficiency of a military operation. Don Ricardo was mobilizing his entire force for what he undoubtedly saw as a punitive expedition that would both reclaim his property and teach the Apache a lesson about challenging white authority. As darkness fell, Victoria made her way back to the Apache village through routes she now knew by heart. The transformation that greeted her there was remarkable. What had appeared to be a peaceful agricultural community just hours earlier had become a fortress prepared for siege. Warriors occupied concealed positions throughout the surrounding hills, weapons were distributed and checked, and escape routes were cleared and marked for use in darkness. But perhaps most impressive was the calm efficiency with which the non-combatants prepared for the coming conflict. Women and children would be evacuated to hidden caves before dawn, taking with them the tribe's most precious possessions and enough supplies to survive independently for weeks if necessary. This was not a community facing its first battle, but a people who had learned through bitter experience how to survive against overwhelming odds. Iron Bear found Victoria near the central fire, where she had been helping to prepare the final defensive arrangements. His weathered face showed no trace of anxiety despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "The Mexican took the bait," he said, though it was more of a statement than a question. "How many men?" "At least 30, Victoria replied. "Maybe more. He's bringing everything he has." Iron Bear nodded approvingly. "Good. The more men he brings here, the fewer will be guarding his compound when our warriors arrive to free the other captives." He studied Victoria's face in the firelight. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Victoria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had become her constant companion since agreeing to this plan. Her role in the coming battle was perhaps the most dangerous of all. She would need to allow herself to be captured by Don Ricardo's forces, then escape at precisely the right moment to trigger the ambush that would destroy his power forever. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice carried less confidence than her words. Silent Wolf appeared beside them with the fluid grace that had become so familiar to Victoria over the past weeks. His hand briefly touched her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance that spoke more clearly than any words could have. He began a series of hand signs that Iron Bear translated for Victoria's benefit. "He says the advanced scouts have confirmed the Mexicans' force," Iron Bear reported. 32 men, well armed but moving too fast for proper reconnaissance. They should reach the valley approaches by dawn. Victoria nodded, understanding that the final phase of their plan was now beginning. Within hours, she would either be free forever or dead, with no middle ground between those extremes. The weight of that reality should have been crushing, but instead she found herself feeling oddly calm. After months of powerlessness, of being acted upon rather than acting, she was finally taking control of her own fate. The next few hours passed. In a blur of final preparations, Victoria changed into clothing that would make her easier to spot from a distance. A white dress that Iron Bear's wives had prepared specifically for this purpose, designed to flutter in the wind and catch the early morning light. She memorized the precise timing that would be crucial to the plan's success and reviewed the signals that would coordinate her actions with those of the hidden Apache warriors. Most importantly, she spent precious minutes alone with Silent Wolf, sharing what might be their final conversation. through the wordless communication they had developed. His golden eyes reflected the same mixture of fear and determination that she felt, and his gentle touch on her face carried all the tenderness that his voice could never express. As the first pale light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern mountains, Victoria took her position in the carefully chosen location where Don Ricardo's men would find her. It was a small grove of cottonwood trees near the village's main water source, visible from the surrounding hills, but apparently unguarded. To approaching enemies, it would appear that the Apache had carelessly left their most valuable prisoner exposed and vulnerable. The reality was far different. Every tree, every boulder, every fold in the ground around Victoria's position concealed Apache warriors armed with rifles and ready to turn the grove into a killing ground at a moment's notice. But the concealment was so perfect that even Victoria, who knew approximately where the warriors were hidden, could detect no sign of their presence. Don Ricardo's force announced its arrival with all the subtlety of a thunderstorm. Victoria heard them long before she saw them, the sound of horses moving at speed across rocky ground, the jingle of harness and weapons, the voices of men who believed themselves to be approaching an easy victory. They made no attempt at stealth, confirming Iron Bear's prediction that arrogance would overcome tactical sense. When the riders finally appeared on the ridge overlooking the grove, Victoria had to suppress a gasp of recognition. Don Ricardo himself led the group, mounted on a magnificent black stallion and wearing the kind of elaborate costume that suggested he viewed this expedition as a form of theater. Behind him rode Carlos and the other familiar faces from Casa del Sol, along with additional men who must have been hired specifically for this operation. Victoria forced herself to play her assigned role, rising from beside the stream, where she had been pretending to drink and shading her eyes as if surprised by their sudden appearance. At this distance, Don Ricardo couldn't see her expression, but he could certainly observe her apparent isolation and vulnerability. She watched him survey the scene below, his calculating gaze taking in the peaceful village, the absence of visible defenders, and most importantly, the figure of his escaped property standing apparently unprotected in the morning sunlight. Victoria could almost read his thoughts. This was easier than he had expected. Confirmation that Apache arrogance had led them to underestimate his capabilities. Don Ricardo raised his hand, signaling his men to begin their descent into the valley. The sight filled Victoria with a mixture of terror and anticipation. In a few minutes, she would be face to face with the man who had held her captive, who had bought and sold human beings like livestock, who had destroyed Silent Wolf's voice. For the crime of showing mercy to a fellow victim, the riders approached in a formation that spoke of military training, a main body with flankers positioned to prevent escape or ambush, but their confidence was evident in their relaxed postures and casual conversation. They believed themselves to be collecting a runaway slave from a defeated enemy, not riding into the most carefully planned trap in Apache military history. Victoria waited until they were within 50 yards before beginning to run, as if only now realizing the danger she faced. She fled toward the village with every appearance of panic, but her route was carefully calculated to draw the pursuers into the precise position where the ambush would be most effective. Don Ricardo spurred his horse forward, clearly intending to capture his prize personally. "Victoria!" he called out, his voice carrying the same tone of possessive authority that had haunted her dreams. "There's nowhere to run, my dear. Come back to where you belong." Victoria glanced over her shoulder, allowing her former captor to see the fear on her face, while actually checking to ensure that his men were moving into the killing zone. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and some of the raiders might escape. Too late, and she might not reach safety before the shooting started. Don Ricardo was close enough now that she could see his face clearly. The months since her escape had not been kind to him. His features showed the strain of dealing with increased scrutiny from territorial authorities, with the disruption to his criminal operations and with the blow to his reputation caused by Victoria's successful flight. This was a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling, who saw recapturing his escaped property as essential to restoring his power and prestige. "You've caused me considerable trouble, Victoria," he called out as his horse closed the distance between them. "But I'm prepared to be forgiving, provided you show proper appreciation for my mercy." Victoria reached the predetermined position, a large boulder that would provide cover when the shooting started, and turned to face her pursuer. For a moment, she allowed herself to meet Don Ricardo's eyes directly, letting him see not the fear he expected, but the cold determination of someone who had moved far beyond his power to intimidate. "I'll never belong to you again," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air, "and neither will any other woman after today." Don Ricardo's expression shifted from confident possession to puzzled anger. Something in Victoria's tone, in her position, in the very air around them, suggested that this encounter was not proceeding as he had expected. His hand moved instinctively toward the pistol at his side. That movement was the signal Iron Bear had been waiting for. The hillsides around the grove erupted in rifle fire as 30 Apache warriors opened fire simultaneously from concealed positions. The carefully planned ambush had been sprung with devastating effect. Victoria dove behind the boulder as bullets whistled through the air above her head. The sound was deafening, not just the crack of rifles, but the screams of wounded horses, the shouts of confused men, and the war cries of Apache warriors as they pressed their attack. When she raised her head to assess the situation, Victoria saw that the first volley had accomplished exactly what Iron Bear had intended. Half of Don Ricardo's force was down, their horses killed or fleeing, their formation shattered by the surprise attack. The survivors were trapped in the open ground of the grove, taking cover behind trees and rocks that provided little protection against attackers positioned on the surrounding high ground. Don Ricardo himself had survived the initial assault, though his magnificent stallion lay dying nearby. He crouched behind a fallen log, with Carlos and perhaps 6 other men, returning fire toward muzzle flashes that appeared and disappeared among the rocks above them. But the real battle was just beginning. The battle raged for less than 30 minutes, but it felt like hours to Victoria as she crouched behind the boulder, listening to the deadly symphony of gunfire and war cries echoing through the canyon. The Apache had chosen their ground well. Every advantage of terrain, timing, and surprise worked in their favor, while Don Ricardo's men found themselves trapped in an impossible position. From her shelter, Victoria could see the systematic destruction of the force that had once seemed so formidable. Apache warriors moved like ghosts among the rocks above, appearing just long enough to fire precise shots before melting back into concealment. Don Ricardo's men, trained for raids against defenseless settlements and intimidation of unarmed civilians, found themselves outmatched by opponents who had been fighting for survival their entire lives. The end came suddenly. Carlos, attempting to rally the surviving men for a desperate charge toward higher ground, stepped into the open for just a moment too long. An Apache bullet found its mark, and Don Ricardo's most trusted enforcer collapsed onto the sandy ground. With their leader down and their position hopeless, the remaining raiders began to surrender, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands in defeat. Don Ricardo himself was among the last to give up, continuing to fire his pistol even when it became clear that resistance was futile. When he finally emerged from behind the fallen log with his hands raised, his face showed the disbelief of a man whose entire worldview had just collapsed. He had built his power on the assumption that superior weapons and ruthless tactics would always triumph over what he saw as primitive opposition. The Apache had proven him catastrophically wrong. Iron Bear emerged from concealment, followed by his warriors, their faces grim but satisfied. The old chief approached the defeated raiders with the dignity of a man who understood that victory, carried responsibilities as well as rewards. "You came to our land to reclaim stolen property," Iron Bear said, addressing Don Ricardo directly. "Instead, you have learned that some things cannot be owned, some people cannot be bought, and some crimes cannot go unpunished." Don Ricardo's response was a snarl of rage and frustration. This is an act of war against the United States government. When the territorial authorities learn what you've done, they will learn that an Apache village defended itself against criminal raiders, Iron Bear interrupted calmly. They will also learn about your business practices when we present the evidence that Silent Wolf has been gathering for months. At the mention of Silent Wolf's name, Don Ricardo's expression shifted from anger to something approaching fear. "Where is that treacherous mute? Let him face me like a man, instead of hiding behind Apache skirts." Victoria stood up from behind her boulder, no longer needing its protection. "Silent Wolf is where he belongs," she said, facing her former captor without flinching. "Leading the force that is, at this very moment, freeing every woman you've imprisoned at Casa del Sol." The revelation hit Don Ricardo like a physical blow. While he had been chasing Victoria across the desert and into the Apache ambush, his compound had been left with minimal defenses. Silent Wolf's intimate knowledge of the fortress's weaknesses, combined with the element of complete surprise, would have made the rescue operation devastatingly effective. "Impossible," Don Ricardo whispered. But his face showed that he knew it was not only possible, but inevitable. His entire criminal empire was crumbling while he stood helpless in an enemy canyon, surrounded by the survivors of his shattered force. Iron Bear gestured to his warriors, who began the process of binding the prisoners for transport. "You will be taken to Tombstone and turned over to the territorial marshal, along with evidence of your crimes. The women you have abused will testify against you, and justice will finally be served." As the Apache began organizing their captives for the journey to town, Victoria found herself feeling an unexpected mixture of emotions, relief certainly, and satisfaction at seeing Don Ricardo finally face consequences for his actions. But also a profound sense of completion, as if a chapter of her life that had begun with Marcus's betrayal was finally drawing to a close. The sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Silent Wolf and his rescue party. Victoria's heart leaped as she saw him riding down into the canyon, alive and apparently unharmed. Behind him came a group of Apache warriors escorting a wagon that carried the freed captives from Casa del Sol. Victoria ran toward the approaching group, her eyes fixed on Silent Wolf's face. When he dismounted and opened his arms to her, she felt a sense of homecoming that transcended anything she had experienced in her previous life. This man, who could not speak, but whose actions proclaimed his love more clearly than any words, had risked everything to ensure her freedom and that of other innocent victims. The reunion was brief but profound. Silent Wolf's golden eyes spoke of successful completion of their mission, of dangers faced and overcome, of a future that was finally possible. Through their wordless communication, he conveyed that Casa del Sol had been taken without significant resistance, that all the captive women had been freed, and that Don Ricardo's criminal organization had been completely destroyed. Among the freed women in the wagon, Victoria recognized faces from her time at the compound, women who had arrived after her, newer victims of Don Ricardo's trafficking operation. Their expressions showed the same mixture of disbelief and hope that Victoria had felt during her own escape. They were free, but they would need time to understand what that freedom truly meant. The journey to Tombstone took 2 days, during which Victoria had time to consider her future. The Apache had offered her a permanent place in their community, recognizing her as someone who had proven herself worthy of their respect and protection. It was a tempting offer, life among people who valued honor and courage above wealth and status, in a landscape that was harsh but honest. But Victoria also understood that her experiences had given her a unique opportunity to help other women who might find themselves in similar circumstances. Her testimony against Don Ricardo would carry weight precisely because she was an educated, white woman whose word would be believed by judges and juries who might dismiss the accounts of Apache or Mexican victims. When they finally reached Tombstone, the territorial marshal was waiting with a small army of federal deputies. Word of Don Ricardo's capture had preceded them, and the authorities were eager to finally bring charges against a criminal whose operations had embarrassed the territorial government for years. The trial that followed was swift and decisive. Victoria's testimony, combined with evidence gathered by Silent Wolf during his time infiltrating Don Ricardo's organization, painted a picture of systematic human trafficking that shocked even the frontier community's hardened sensibilities. Don Ricardo was sentenced to life imprisonment, while his surviving associates received terms that ensured they would never again threaten innocent women. But perhaps more important than the legal proceedings was what happened to the freed women. Victoria used Don Ricardo's gold, the money that Silent Wolf had given her in the Apache village, to establish a foundation that helped trafficking victims rebuild their lives. Some chose to return to their families, others started new lives in distant cities, and a few, like Victoria herself, remained in the Southwest to help other women who needed protection and support. Victoria and Silent Wolf were married in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with Christian customs, creating something new that honored both cultures while transcending the boundaries that had once seemed impossible to cross. They built a home near the Apache village, close enough to maintain their connection to the community that had saved them both, but positioned to serve as a refuge for women fleeing abuse and exploitation. Years later, when Victoria looked back on the terrible months of her captivity and the dangerous weeks that followed her escape, she realized that her ordeal had ultimately led her to a life of greater purpose and deeper happiness than anything she could have imagined in her sheltered youth in Millbrook. Marcus's betrayal, devastating though it had been, had set in motion a chain of events that revealed strengths she never knew she possessed, and brought her together with a man whose love transcended all the barriers that society had tried to place between them. The bag of gold that Silent Wolf had given her during their courtship still sat in their home, now empty but preserved as a reminder of the choice between material wealth and human dignity. It represented the moment when their relationship had moved from practical alliance to profound love, when two outcasts had found in each other the family they had both lost to the cruelty of others. Victoria Hayes. Now Victoria Wolf, though she used both names depending on the circumstances, had learned that freedom was not something that could be granted by others or taken away by force. True freedom came from within, from the courage to choose love over fear, justice over safety, and hope over despair. And in the vast desert landscape of the Southwest, under skies that stretched from horizon to horizon, she had found that freedom. At last. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.